All right, starting this one without the lav mic because the phone mic picks up sounds a little bit better of amps. This is a black panel Super Reverb, belongs to a friend of mine. It's a hard gigging amp. It's had a lot of work done over the years. And he sent me some recordings he did on his phone of strange sounds it was making. And I couldn't really hear much through the clips. I just said, send it in. So let's wait and see what it does coming on with the volumes off. And we'll see if we even need to try it with the guitar, or whether the sound is just nasty with the volumes off. I'm going to tap on the tubes a little bit. Well, that's promising. It might just be a preamp thing. A little bit of a bleed. Is that on both channels? Much less on this channel. Let's double check the reverb channel. That's some bleed and intermodulation there. It's not as loud as it should be. The Super Reverb on 4 should be much louder than this. I would expect the volume here at 4 to be what it really is here, almost 6.5. Reverb works. And when you have lower volume overall, it can just be a bad preamp tube. It can be something in the circuit, a component. Sometimes it'll be either an output tube isn't working, or you have a big imbalance in the phase inverter. But if that's the case, I would also expect it to be clipping a lot more than it is, not just lower in volume. And that's way more bleed than I want this amp to have. So it's time to open this up and stick this on the bench and take a look inside. Even though I've not heard the nasty sounds he was getting, something is amiss. All right, this amp has been in a lot over the past couple years, and I'm not the first tech to work on it. Already been recapped, all the resistors changed as well, so I know this is 99% likely to be very good. It has the original choke and output transformer from 1967. The power transformer had been replaced previous to my getting to work on the amp. I replaced the reverb transformer a few years ago. The original had died. It's got some tungsol 606 SDRs, which are usually very reliable. We'll look at the preamp tubes in a little bit if that proves to be a problem. But let's flip this over and look at the inside. All right, this amp is a mixture of my work and the previous guy's work. There are things in here that I would not have done, but they have always seemed to be working, so I didn't feel the need to reinvent the wheel. I had previously changed out the volume pots and installed shielded wire, which this amp originally did not have, from volume pots and input jacks to the grids. So I'm a little bit surprised by that bleed, and I'll be taking a closer look at that in a moment. Down here at the output section, previous tech had installed these 1 ohm resistors from cathode to ground and had changed out the screen grids, and has 3 new ceramic octal sockets that were also the previous guy's work. And I had redone the various chassis grounds back to chassis as they were in '65, as opposed to using the transformer mounting bolts. So I'm about to power this up and take some voltage measurements and such, and see about moving some of the lead dress in this area, and if that affects the bleed. I'm going to measure the board for DC and such. But before I do any of that, one of the things I want to do is get an idea if all 4 speakers are working right in the cabinet. Now, this is not going to be the end-all be-all test for that, but first I want to just take a measurement and see what the resistance of the cabinet is. It should be close to 2 ohms. 1.9. So yeah, okay. All 4 speakers are working as far as being resistors. Now, that does not mean that all 4 speakers are putting out the full level, but I don't think that the speakers are the problem. I will confirm that as necessary. But first of all, I'm going to plug this in and just see what I see, and we will report back. When I powered it on just a second ago, and I wasn't recording, damn it, there was a big sound as B+ started to flow, like something was arcing. I powered it off. I've got the camera running now. I'm going to see if that happens again, and if we can narrow that down to where it is. And I'm going to be looking at the tubes, the rectifier and output tubes as it does that, just to see if I see anything. So forgive the poor lighting. I'm going to turn off my bench light, so I'm much more likely to see anything going wrong in those tubes. So let's power it back on again. All right, this time it did not make the nasty noise. Let me move some bubble wrap out of my way so it's not a continuous source of noise in the video. So I'm going to wiggle the tubes before they get too hot to wiggle. All right, nothing there, but it sure sounded like something arcing. There's a big crackle, snap, no pop, that made me think of a connection that was bad or reconnecting itself. So it's time to get in here with the chopstick. I use a plastic chopstick. I'm just going to tug on some wires. The one wire I'm not going to tug on is the grid connection. I don't want to lose grid connection to the output tubes while it's on. But it wasn't the kind of sound I would associate with a grid connection. Huh. And now, of course, everything seems to be just fine. Triple checking these wires from the various cathodes to chassis. They all seem to be very solid. All right, I'm going to take all the tube shields off and manipulate the tubes and see if I can find any crackle. I wish I'd been recording for that noise, but I don't know if we would have seen anything. The phase inverter tube's got a little bit of noise to it. V2 as well. There was a little bit of noise there as I wiggled the phase inverter tube, but it's mostly gone. It's not the kind of sound I was hearing. It was a really sharp, loud crackle, like something had arced. No microphonics in the output tubes. I'm doing a visual inspection of solder joints to see if I see anything that looks like it might have pulled out and cracked. And this is fun because it did not make that sound when I powered it up in the other room when it was in the cabinet. But maybe it'll do it again. All right, let's see. Let me think. Something that happens when the amp is cold. I first power it up after it's been cooled off completely. But it doesn't do it every time. That's just a recipe for fun. None of the solder joints on the phase inverter seem to affect it. It may just need to clean that socket a little bit. All right. I think in a little bit I'm just going to turn it off, let it cool completely. And while it does that, I'm going to measure all the resistors in circuit. But before I do that, I want to see if I can find where that bleed was coming from. So let me get a guitar cable and a guitar real quick. All right, guitar plugged in, volume's off. Way more bleed than I would want or expect. And it's not subject to moving these wires, and the leads from the volumes and input jacks are shielded. So I wonder, let me see what preamp tubes are in this thing. Sometimes you will get bleed from within the B+ stage with certain tubes. I've noticed it mostly with JJs for whatever reason. And let me explain what I'm thinking. The volume, from the input jack, the signal goes to pin 2 of, in this case, V2 on the other channel to V1. And then it goes from there through the plate to the tone stack and the volume then feeds pin 7 of each respective tube, and then goes on down the line. So the signal from on V1A and V2A is always there if the guitar volume is on. It's only muted by the volume pot. And this is muting it there at the point where the volume feeds the next stage, which is the second triode. But if there is a path for signal through the B+, that would normally be something which is eliminated by decoupling. But in the case of a Fender like this, a lot of these stages share that same B+ node, so you can have signal passing on B+. Let's see what happens if I pull preamp tubes and swap them around. So it's a tongue saw in V2. I've not had that bleed issue with tongue saws. Both V1 and V2 have tongue saws. Let's see if we have any bleed right now. I predict no. No. What's in V4? A Mullard CV4004, a very good tube typically. And then in the phase inverter we have a JJ ECC81. Let me pull the JJ ECC81 from the reverb spot for right now. I'll get a paper towel so I don't burn the heck out of myself. Those get hot. 12AT7's ECC81s in a Fender, the reverb driver spot. That tube is being driven beyond its capabilities. It's amazing they work. It's not really the best design, but they tend to last long enough for most people. It's one of those things where Leo kind of got away with it because the old spec tubes were better. All right, we're going to try this first of all with the bleed in the normal channel, because that takes out some of the tubes in the equation. If you're curious about such things, the standalone reverbs that Fender made, the Dick Dale stuff, those used 6L6s or EL84s for the reverb driver, opposed to the little 12AT7 in these amps. All right, let's see if we have bleed just going into the normal channel with the volume off. No bleed there, so that says it should be. What happens if I introduce V4 to that? I'm going to use that tongue saw for this, because V1 and V4, while the circuit path that you think of as the circuit path is the same, they are on the same filtered node. Still no bleed, which is interesting because before we had bleed on this channel. All right, I'm going to put that Mullard in V2. Used to have a tongue saw there. Let's see if any bleed comes back to channel 1, the normal channel. Yeah, there's bleed on channel 1 when the preamp tube for channel 2 is in place. Now, that could be one of two things. It could be a problem with the cathode bypass cap right here, because this cathode is shared for V1B and V2B. And without that cap across it, you can have bleed from channel to channel. But I suspect that it's also in the power supply And let me see if I can check that by pulling V4 at this point. Because if it's bleeding from channel 1 to channel 2, I just eliminated the next stage of channel 2. And that bleed is there. So, this is interesting. And I'm trying to figure out how to solve it. Well, for shits and giggles, let's see. Here's a JJ ECC 83. And I'm going to put it in V2 where that mullet is now. And see if it makes any difference. Nope. If I pull V1, as expected, all the sound goes away. Let's put in another tube for V1. Here's another JJ. Now I have had this kind of issue with JJs in the past, and going to tongue saws fixed it. Now I've got that issue with tongue saws. Let's see what going to JJs does. Now that's interesting. With two JJs, I don't have that bleed. Let me put that Mullard back in V4 and see if any bleed comes in. Before, it was a problem I was having with Slovakian tubes. Now it's a problem I'm having with Russian tubes. All right, I don't have any bleed now at all. Let me switch to the reverb channel. Notice that I have not soldered anything, I have not changed anything, I've not even measured a resistor. I'm going on intuition based on past experience here as far as the weird bleed. So now let's see if we have bleed on the reverb channel. No bleed. Let me put in take out this JJ and put a tongue saw back into V2 and see if that bleed comes back. It's always good to test your hypothesis, right? Let's take it a second to warm up. There it is. All right, so the problem is not in the amp or its circuitry. The problem is in the preamp tubes. And I don't know why it's happening with tongue saws but not JJs. On other amps, that was the reverse. Let me put the reverb driver tube back in. It's one that used to be the phase inverter that was giving us a little bit of noise before. Now, when you have an amp that has symptoms like this with the bleed, and that bleed is in the power supply like this, actually in the B+, it's not just going to appear or exhibit itself as bleed. That's going to be a signal from one stage interfering with a signal from the other stage, no matter the gain. And so remember when I said this thing was low volume for a super reverb, but not distorting like if only half the output were working. This all makes sense to me. That's intermodulation distortion. Let me set it to 4, which was way too quiet before. Very nice. All right, so before I put this whole thing back together and just tell the guy he needs 2 new preamp tubes, which is a good diagnosis for anyone who owns one of these to receive. And makes me feel better as far as the work I did in the past still holding up. Let me make sure that the vibrato is working right. I know the reverb's working right. Where's my little vibrato thing? Here it is. I have a little dummy plug I use for these. Much easier than hooking up a foot switch. Just to test on the bench. Yeah, well, I can see the bulb flashing. Let's see what it sounds like. All right, it is working well and has no ticking. I changed the 3 caps in the LFO before, and I put this cap across the roach, which deticks it. But what I am hearing is that as you quickly change the speed, it doesn't track with the pot. It kind of cuts out for a minute and then comes back. And that's because this amp has this 22 microfarad cap here across this 100K, which a lot of them do. It's actually on the schematic, but it's not what they actually did much in production. Most of the amps in production had a 5 microfarad there. So I'm going to change that out for a 4.7 while I have the amp on the bench, since it needs no other electronic work. It's nothing, it's not a deal breaker the way it is now. It's just nice if you change the speed knob kind of quickly that it changes at that same rate. Now, this does not mean that I've gotten everything that's possibly wrong with this amp out of the way, because he was reporting strange noises that I did not get. And there was that sparky sound on startup I mentioned at the beginning of this video. So I'm going to turn it off, and I'm going to replace that cap just because I have it on the bench and it's easy to do. But what I'm thinking is, when I was playing it, I just hit the mic, sorry. When I was playing it at the beginning of this video in the other room, it was still in its cabinet. Before I powered it off, I made sure that I was playing like this, and I unplugged it from the wall and continued to play until I didn't hear anything. What that does was fully drain the filter caps, or almost completely drain the filter caps. Whereas before, the owner would have just powered it off and then brought it to me. So the first time I powered it on, the caps probably had a residual charge. And when I powered it on, the caps did not have a residual charge. There was that sound. And I suspect that that's why I heard that sound, and I want to get rid of that sound. And just to explain what my thinking on that, when a capacitor has no charge on it, and you initially power it on, for a few milliseconds, it is a dead short. It appears as a dead short. Then as it fills with voltage, it's no longer short. And that can be really hard on the rectifier tube, and it can be really hard on a standby switch. Now, I did not use the standby switch, so that's out of the equation. We test to make sure the standby switch is good. I changed it 2 years ago, or a year ago. That's fine. That's normal behavior for one of these. So I'm going to power it off and drain all the voltage off. I'm going to change that cap in that cap there in the tremolo, and then we're going to power it back on and see if that noise goes away. And if that noise is there when I power it on next, when the caps are drained, then we'll address that. And that should have drained the caps a lot. So instead of having about 450 volts, I might have 10, 20 volts at this point. Let's verify that though. It's always good to verify. Let me put the guitar down. Put it so you can see it. All right, right now, two and a half volts. So yeah, that did a real good job of draining. And that would explain why, it might explain why it popped when I powered it on, if there's something in there that's saying that as a dead short. So while I have that, I'm gonna go ahead and use a screwdriver and get the rest of that voltage out. So it will be even lower than 2.5 volts when we next check it. And now it measures half a volt. It's climbing back up a little bit. Caps have some degree of voltage memory, but be interesting to see what happens next time I power it on. Turns out I am out of 4.7 microfarad caps, so that vibrato will be left untouched unless I need to order a bunch of other stuff for this amp. There's no need to keep the amp out of service just for that nicety. If I were going to be doing any major work on this, I would certainly order the part. And I usually have a whole bunch of them. I must have just run out, so it's time to order a whole bunch more because I use them all the time. What I have done to hopefully help that startup shock that I think this amp was experiencing is I've installed two 1N4007 diodes in series with the HT feed from the power transformer. And those run in series with the tube rectifier. They don't affect the B plus much. They don't really affect anything except that they help the tube rectifier handle current. That does not mean that this one is still healthy, because once it gets repeated or even occasional dead short, some rectifier tubes just give up the ghost. I believe this one is the Chopstick, or it might be a JJ. The Chopstick and the JJ take turns being reliable or unreliable. This is the Chopstick. So what we're going to do is I'm going to confirm that we have no or almost no voltage stored in the filter caps. Let's see if it came up from half a volt before this. And then we're going to power on and we're going to watch the rectifier tube and see if we see any sign of arcing or just surges, and if we hear anything. But right now, all right, we've got 42 millivolts stored in those caps. So that's a good place to start. That's about as cold as they're ever going to get. If there's a short condition as far as the rectifier tube is concerned, we should hear it. We might even see it. And then it's a matter of whether the problem's in the rectifier tube or whether one of the filter caps is bad. It's unlikely, given that they are FNTs that I installed within the past 5 years, but it doesn't mean it's impossible. So let's move the camera so we'll take a look at that rectifier tube and see what happens when we power it up. I've got the bench light off again so we can see more if anything happens in this tube. Let me adjust the lighting that the camera has so that it more closely aligns to what I'm seeing with my eyes. Cameras and eyes don't work the same, you see. That's about what I'm seeing. It's going to be a little bit grainy on this, but so be it. All right. I'm going to unplug the lav mic so we're more likely to hear any nasty sounds. Got channel volumes off. Unplugging the lav mic. And powering it on. Let's watch and listen. All right, that's test number one. So that's test number one. And in test number one, we brought it up without using the standby switch. And we are going to drain those caps again and repeat this with the amp in standby and then take it out of standby, because that way it'll tell us if there's an issue with any of the caps after the standby switch. But this is a very promising result. We get it set up for the next bit. Now we're going to repeat that with the amp in standby. So I'm powering it on. Let the rectifier tube really begin to glow. Watching the heaters on the output tubes come up. Let's take it out of standby, see what happens. A little bit of a blue flash there. That's nothing really to worry about. Try to see if it's on both of them. Just this one. Interesting. All right, let me power the amp off. And I'm going to swap the two 6L6s back and forth and see if the problem stays with the tube. That's not really a problem, but if the behavior stays with the tube or the socket, that can tell me a little bit more. I've had people comment or question that I am touching tubes with my fingers, and isn't it bad for the glass and blah, blah, blah. That's true for halogen bulbs. Aha! The center locator pin is broken off on this one. I can glue that back, or I can put a new one in there. For right now, I know I've got it lined up where it's supposed to be. This amp probably was dropped or set down pretty hard at some point for that to happen, but that's not necessarily a tube failure. If we had a failure, it would have lost vacuum and be a whiteout condition. So let's power it back on in standby. Wait for them to warm up. And we want to see if that blue flash stays on this socket or it stays with this tube. And again, those blue flashes are just gaseous conditions in the bulb, and it's not necessarily indicative or doesn't necessarily correlate to an actual problem. You can have tubes, especially the short bottle 6L6s, that flash blue or glow blue and work for years and years and years and sound just fine. Sometimes that can accompany another failure mode of the tube. Let's take it out of standby and see what happens. I didn't see it that time on either. All right, it's a little bit on this left one. So that's with the socket, not with the tube. So I'm going to power it back off. And I'm going to drain it again. And I'm going to reflow some connections on that tube, just in case. All right, reflowed everything on V8, just to be sure. And I'm going to power it on with amp in standby and repeat the whole process. If that blue flash is still there, it may just be one of those things. It's not necessarily indicative of a problem. But once we get to this point, I'm going to leave the amp running with a test looper, just to see how the amp does over the course of a few hours, because it's the only real way to be sure. Something can be fine for on your bench for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 30 minutes, but let's reproduce the effects of a 3-hour gig before we say that something like this from 67 with all this work is still really healthy. Take it out of standby now. All right, still a little bit of that flash. Since it's following the socket, not the tube, I'm not all that concerned about it. Doesn't happen if you don't use the standby tube. Sorry, the standby switch. And the standby switch is not necessary in this amp. So let me confirm that that bleed is gone. It is gone. Let me confirm that the amp is loud. All right, I'm much happier with the sound of this, much more happy. The volume overall is much greater. All that bleed is gone, and that bleed would have been exhibiting itself as parasitic oscillation within the circuit, which is why the sound is louder now, and the signal has more clarity. I'm much less concerned about that startup crackle that we got, because I have put in those diodes that help the rectifier tube along. I don't think there's anything wrong with the filter caps or any of the other components in the B+. I'm going to glue this locator key back onto this 6L6, just so that if the owner takes it out, he'll be able to put it back in and get the holes lined up where they ought to be. But pending a burn-in test where this thing gets some playing for a couple of hours, I think we're in a much better place than we were. So I'm going to stop here for a while.